Much for your analysis. And, well, we've been talking about same-sex marriage. We'll inevitably do that with our next guest, but the issue that the government has been trying to ensure gets some attention, and they'll be continuing to do so going forward, is the cost of power in this country, power prices, energy more broadly, and how that energy mix should be brought together. And the Energy and Environment Minister, Josh Frydenberg, is our guest live from Melbourne. Thanks very much for your company.
Nice to be with you.
Let's start, before we get to your portfolio, we've got plenty of time and a lot to discuss in that space, but let's start overseas if we can. North Korea, how concerned are you that this is going to turn into a hot war very quickly?
Well, obviously we're very concerned about the escalating rhetoric across not just the peninsula but also involving the United States. Quite clearly, North Korea's behaviour has been belligerent, its language has been bellicose, and it's no surprise that the United States has responded forcefully. But Donald Trump has a first-class national security team. That's been commented on by everyone from John McCain to Kim Beazley. People like Mattis and McMaster, his new Chief of Staff, John Kelly, are all military men who know the high price of war. So I'm very confident that he will get the best advice about the steps ahead, but we'll all be watching very closely. The other thing to say, Peter, is that, as the Prime Minister has reiterated many times, China is the country with the most political and economic leverage over North Korea. So this is really a moment of truth too for China to step up and use that leverage to ensure that we de-escalate some of the tensions that have been rising
Minister, China thinks that Donald Trump's rhetoric has been too inflammatory. They've told him that directly, is my understanding. Do you agree with them?
Look, Donald Trump is reacting in a way any major leader would after being threatened directly by another country. And the comments and the behaviour of North Korea have been acceptable, not just in recent days, but over a long period of time.
Minister, if I can quote the Prime Minister, do you feel comfortable about being tied at the hip to the Trump administration?
Well, we absolutely feel comfortable with the strength of the bilateral relationship, the importance of ANZUS, not only to our country, but also it's very important to the United States to know that they've got a strong ally and friend such as Australia. It's a relationship that has stood the test of time, that has been very strong through different administrations, Democrat and Republican, Labor and Liberal, and I'm sure that that will continue. And we know that the relationship between Prime Minister Turnbull and President Trump has been very forthright, but they've also developed a good working relationship, and I'm confident that that will hold us in good stead going forward.
Now, you're well versed in foreign policy, so let me ask you the critical question here. Do you think the United States should accept that North Korea is becoming a nuclear weapon state and seek to use containment to address this? Or do you accept what seems to be the position of President Trump, that it is intolerable for the United States to accept North Korea, which has the nuclear capacity to deliver weapons onto American soil?
Well, not to dodge your question, Paul, but obviously that is a matter for the United States military and foreign policy establishment. That being said, I don't think any country wants to leave itself vulnerable to attack from another country, and we've seen that in the Middle East recently with Israel's response to Iran's nuclear weapons program and the existential threat that they have felt that has posed to them. So I don't think any country wants to leave itself vulnerable to attack, let alone from such a rogue state as North Korea, with a young, inexperienced leader who's made such damaging and dangerous threats.
Okay, well that answer leads to the next question. Are you concerned about, or do you accept that President Trump might engage in a preemptive military strike?
Look, it's not for me to opine on those matters. I'm not in the National Security Committee of Cabinet, and indeed these will be matters for the US administration. What I can say is that Malcolm Turnbull, Maurice Payne and Julie Bishop are taking these issues with the utmost seriousness. They're being briefed on a regular basis by the heads of our defence, intelligence and foreign policy establishment. And of course, the Prime Minister recently had a lengthy conversation with Vice President Pence. So we know that we have an open line of communication with the United States, and we also know from Australia's perspective, regional security and stability is our priority, and obviously North Korea's behaviour has posed a threat to that.
Why is the Australian Bureau of Statistics calling the postal plebiscite a postal survey?
Well, consistent with what it's done previously, and as you know, Minister Cormann has cited the example in 1974 with Gough Whitlam when they went out to survey the Australian people's views on changing the national anthem. This is a process by which it's voluntary for people to respond to the letter that they get, and you know, that reflects the nature of this process. But we're very confident, Peter, that we have both the constitutional and the statutory basis for conducting this process in the way that's been outlined.
What kind of response rate do you think is necessary for there to be a definitive result, whether it's a yes or a no response? I mean, you wouldn't want it to be as low as 20 or 30%, surely.
Well, I'm not going to tie my hands on that one, because who knows how many people will respond to the survey, because you know, it is obviously on an issue that's important to a lot of people, but it's not our preferred option. Our preferred option was to have a compulsory plebiscite.
Well, let me word it differently then, Minister. I mean, I understand you don't want to put the number, but let me put a number then. I mean, if you have a 20 or a 30% response rate, will that satisfy you?
Well, what satisfies me is the process itself. And if you want to talk about low turnouts and legitimacy, in the French presidential election, they had a turnout under 50%. In the United States presidential election, it was barely above 50%. In Australia, we're a rare beast, if you like, by having, you know, compulsory voting. That would have been our preference on this occasion for a national plebiscite, but unfortunately Bill Shorten cares more about his own political position than the issue of same-sex marriage. Otherwise he would have, you know, let this issue be done and dusted a long time ago through a compulsory full attendance plebiscite, as was our preferred option.
I wonder how acquainted you are with the law of unintended consequences, Minister, because we've seen a massive uptick in enrolments over the course of the last 4 or 5 days since this was announced. And that uptick in enrolments is largely young voters that weren't on the electoral roll. We know when you look at voting trends through the Australian Election Survey that Professor Ian McAllister and others have done for years after elections, that younger people disproportionately vote Labor over Liberal. Are you guys creating an unintended consequence of upping enrolments by hundreds of thousands of young people to vote on same-sex marriage, who come election time will make a hell of a difference to the viability of coalition MPs holding on to marginal seats?
Well, the more people that enrol, the better, and I don't think you'd find a politician who would disagree with that. They want as much public participation in federal elections and state elections as possible. Indeed, in this plebiscite,
but you've mobilised a voter base that we know from the data will be more likely to vote for Bill Shorten and Malcolm Turnbull, and you're already way behind in the polls.
Well, we've got nothing to be afraid of when it comes to people voting at elections or voting in plebiscites. The more people that participate and exercise their natural right to participate in our wonderful, healthy, robust Australian democracy, the better, and I look forward to more people registering in the weeks ahead.
What's your position, Minister, and will you campaign?
My position, as stated publicly on many occasions, is to support same-sex marriage. And every time I'm asked, I will repeat that. As for my electorate, I will be encouraging as many people as possible to participate and indeed to vote yes. But when it comes to my broader position in terms of campaigning on this issue, Paul, I've got a bigger fish to fry, and that is energy policy, and that will be my priority in the weeks and the months ahead, given that this process will take some time till it reaches its conclusion.
If we can just look at the two scenarios, what happens if the no vote gets up? What does the government do then?
Well, the Prime Minister's been very clear. If the no vote gets up, then we won't be bringing to the Parliament a private member's bill.
But if the no vote, so if the no vote gets up, you won't bring a private member's bill, so no free vote on same-sex marriage. If the yes vote gets up, you will bring a private member's bill or equivalent, and it'll still be a free vote because you're not binding your members of Parliament. That's what I like to call a double standard, don't you?
No, not at all. We know that if people vote yes, then we would have gone through the process as we promised the Australian people at the last election.
Only for MPs to ignore it if they choose?
Well, look, as you know, many people have strong views on this issue, but judging by the numbers in the chamber, if a free vote is brought to bear under that scenario of a successful yes plebiscite, then I'm very confident it will get the numbers in both chambers.
In the case of a yes vote, are you satisfied about existing protections in relation to conscience, belief and religious freedom, or do you think there's a problem there?
Well, I saw your piece yesterday, Paul, about this matter, and of course there are some, the protections that have been put into the bills that were circulated by others, included for religious people who are conducting weddings to ensure that they would not be forced to conduct these events. So let's just assume that is still the case going forward. But as for the further detail, that can be worked out when the bills come before the Parliament. I'm sure there'll be more work to be done by the various people who are putting forward these bills.
Now, just on that point, do you think that there should be a requirement for the bill, which is going to be the subject of a free vote, to be considered by the Cabinet or by the coalition party room? Because while it's not a government bill as such, it is nonetheless the bill that the government is using to legislate same-sex marriage.
Look, we'll get through those hoops when we come to it.
That's a pretty fundamental, but that's a pretty fundamental question. That is a pretty fundamental question. Should the party room have a say in the bill which is going to legislate same-sex marriage?
Well, right now we're in a position of the party room agreeing to a postal plebiscite, and there was overwhelming support, Paul, for that position. Now, obviously there's legal challenges that are afoot to the postal plebiscite. Based on the advice that we have, we're confident that they will not succeed. So the postal vote should go ahead as planned, and then when the result is in, the next steps will be worked out. As for what the Cabinet and the party room spend their time deliberating, I think it's too early for us to be making a call on that.
What about the time frame, though, Josh Frydenberg? I mean, how long is too long after a plebiscite before you might get around to legislating same-sex marriage? 3 months?
Well, the Prime Minister's made very clear, and Matthias Cormann is the Acting Special Minister of State, that the result will be known by November, and we would hope to proceed as quickly as possible. Indeed, within the time frame of this year would be optimal. But of course, we'll just have to work it out once the result is in.
But is that realistic to get it done this year? I mean, there's so much debate yet to be had around some of the things that Paul wrote about yesterday around these religious protections and how far they do or don't extend. The drafting of the legislation could take a lot longer than a matter of days in the wake of a November result before Parliament rises for the year.
Look, it's a big change. It's an important issue, and obviously we need to get it right. And what Paul has written about is no doubt, they're critically important factors that need to be taken into account. So rather than putting a specific time frame on it, we do know that ballot papers will be arriving in early September. We do know that the result will be known by mid-November, and then obviously decisions can be taken after that about how we proceed through the Parliament if a yes vote is the outcome from the postal plebiscite.
Just one final question on this before we take a break and move on to your portfolio, where there's a lot to discuss as well. Are you really comfortable as one of the younger members of Parliament, knowing that a lot of younger Australians don't really use the post, with it being so archaic, rather than having some form of electronic voting to go with it?
Well, obviously, this is not our preferred option. The preferred option was to be done, Peter, in a way which was consistent with the election processes.
But you could have included through the ABS. I mean, they did it so successfully with the census. You could have included some sort of electronic mechanism rather than just purely postal.
Well, this was the mechanism that was landed on, and obviously it's even broader than what happened back in the 1970s as used by Gough Whitlam. But this seems to be a process that has the statutory and the constitutional basis for going forward. It received this strong support of my colleagues in the party room, and we look forward to the result coming in. And then obviously, once the issue is being dealt with, getting on to the more important issues around economic and national security, and holding Bill Shorten to account for his false war on inequality and his tax and spend agenda.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. We're talking to the Energy and Environment Minister, Josh Frydenberg. A lot going on in his portfolio. We'll get to that when we return.
The government recently made a decision, the first time since Federation, that we will establish as a nation a shipbuilding industry. Navantia started its association with Australia in 2004. Since that time, they have worked closely with Australia and Australian industry. Navantia Australia is the right partner for Australia's continuous shipbuilding program.
Authorised by D. Martinez, Navantia Australia, Mawson Lakes. Spoken by W. King and J. Marciello.
The debate continues across the nation. What is this chocolate blend?
I'm still getting creamy dark.
I'm sticking to intense then smooth.
Let's swap.
Hey, this one's empty.
The creaminess of milk chocolate perfectly blended with rich cocoa. Cadbury Dark Milk.
At Terry White Chemmart, great deals are alive and well. Like selected Duratusk Cough Liquid 200ml varieties at just $8.99 each. Plus Cetaphil 1 litre skincare range just $14.99 each. Hurry, offer ends August 29.
Natural. Oat. Energy. Powered by Uncle Toby's Oats.
Hi Australia, it's me again with another one of my new recipes to feed your family for under $10. Like my delicious penne pasta with in-season sweet pumpkin. Never better than with pork sausage. And just wait till you taste my delicious stir-fried rice noodles with chicken and veggies.
Find Curtis's recipes in store, in the Coles magazine and online.
So the next time you hear,
What's for dinner?
remember you can feed your family of four one of my recipes for under $10 at Coles.
In our fast-paced world, it's easy to miss anything unusual. But with the ongoing threat of terrorism, we all need to play our part by reporting anything suspicious. Even if you think it's probably nothing, the smallest piece of information can be valuable. Calls to the National Security Hotline have already contributed to investigations. If something doesn't add up, speak up by calling the National Security Hotline on 1800 123 400 and help keep Australia safe from terrorism. Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
Double room for $210.
It's only $175 here.
When you're ready.
I will be right here waiting for Hotels Combined. The best hotel deals guaranteed.
What do you think you're doing? There is a Monet sunrise happening. Look at the horizon.
Celebrate the small stuff with Sunbite snack crackers. The goodness of tiny whole grains in a new delicious tasting biscuit.
Make car fly now.
I can't do that, Dave.
My name's not Dave. Let's be honest, the future should have been here ages ago. That's why with AGL you can charge your electric vehicle for $1 a day. So, you with us?
I was always going to be an engineer. I'm going to Japan to look at low emission technology using Australian coal.
High quality Australian coal combined with low emissions technology improves efficiencies and keeps energy costs down.
40% から 45% まで効率が上がっております。
Countries like Japan have affordable and reliable power using low emissions coal.
If new power stations with low emissions coal are already working so well around the world, you have to wonder why we're not doing it here.
Authorised by Greg Evans, Canberra.
The debate continues across the nation. What is this chocolate blend?
It's creamy. It's dark. It's creamy. It's definitely dark. Creamy.
The creaminess of milk chocolate perfectly blended with rich cocoa. Cadbury Dark Milk.
Welcome back. You're watching Sunday Agenda. A reminder, same-sex marriage advocate Christine Foster will be our guest a little bit later in the program, and we'll also be joined by former Liberal leader Dr John Hewson and former Cabinet Minister from the Gillard years, Dr Craig Emerson. All that coming up. But at the moment, our ongoing guest, is Josh Frydenberg, the Minister for Energy and the Environment.
Minister, this week when the government met the retailers, one of their strong messages was they wanted the government to proceed with the clean energy target. Can you tell us, first of all, what's the timetable here? When is this going to be addressed by the government?
Well, as you know, Paul, we got the Finkel recommendations just a couple of months ago, and the Finkel recommendations were the product of an expert panel spending 8 months doing detailed considerations of options to improve the stability and the security of our national electricity market. There were 50 recommendations, and in record time, the Turnbull government adopted 49 of those recommendations and then secured the support of the states and territories for those recommendations. And they're going to be extremely important going forward, for example, requiring large-scale generators to give at least 3 years' notice before closure so we don't have a repeat of Hazelwood, while at the same time requiring wind and solar plants and farms to have their own storage as backup. So that was an important action and decision. Now, the 50th recommendation is the clean energy target, and the purpose behind it is to try to integrate climate and energy policy to provide a level of investment certainty for generation investments that have a 20, 30, 40-year lifespan. Now, Dr Finkel himself said that the clean energy target would not come in until 2020. So we don't need to rush this decision, but we do need to consider it with the level of consideration and detail that it deserves. So that's what we're doing. Obviously, we have got a number of other related issues that we're focusing on, like the amount of dispatchable power that we need in the system, and we'll be getting a report back from the Australian Energy Market Operator on that in just a couple of weeks' time. So that will feed into our final thinking around the clean energy target, which does remain a live issue and a live option for the coalition.
Now, in terms of your thinking about this, to what extent are you prepared to accept a variation of the Finkel clean energy target, or to what extent do you think you need to make pretty radical changes to that so government policy is no longer the Finkel policy?
Well, look, it's too early to say what will be the product of our discussions and consideration of the clean energy target, both at Cabinet and then at the party room level. Other than to say, I think we do need a mechanism that integrates energy and climate policy. Dr Finkel did focus, obviously, on a long-term trajectory for reducing emissions, but he also produced a model which would lead to lower prices overall. What I'm focused on is the outcomes rather than necessarily just the process. And the outcomes for us are affordability and stability at the top of the agenda while we transition to a lower emissions future. You don't hear the Labor Party saying that affordability is their #1 issue. They always try to talk about emissions on an equal level. For us, it's unequivocal. Affordability is our #1 concern as a party when it comes to energy policy, and that's why we're taking action on a number of fronts, whether it's restricting gas exports, reining in the power of the energy networks, calling in the retailers, putting the ACCC as a cop on the beat on the case, or even talking tough to Queensland to get them to ensure that their government-owned generators behave more appropriately rather than lining the profits and the balance sheets of the government at the expense of consumers.
To what extent are you committed to a clean energy target formula which has a critical place for coal, for new coal-fired power plants?
Well, certainly coal, existing and new coal, does have a role to play in our energy mix. Existing coal is the cheapest form of generation today. That's without doubt. You can get coal being generated for $10, $20, $30, $40 a megawatt hour, whereas other new forms of generation are a lot more expensive than that. Even under the Finkel recommendations of a 0.6, a baseline for the clean energy target, you still saw coal represent more than 50% of the energy mix by 2030, which is more than nearly any other OECD country other than Poland.
Sure, but you said
coal
new
will
coal.
be critical.
But you said new coal.
Sure, and new coal...
Which translates to what?
Well, new coal is a Healy plant, and obviously that is an important form of generation that we are seeing throughout Asia, whether it's in developed countries like Japan or in some of the other developing countries in our region. Low emissions, high efficiency coal-fired power stations, one of which I've myself visited in Japan, do have a role to play in the energy mix going forward.
Just on that, Sam Maiden here on Sky News reported during the week that when the energy bosses met with the government, that they made it quite clear that they just didn't see any investment interest or any likelihood of moving down the path of a new coal-fired power plant. Is that your memory of the meeting?
Well, it will be up to the market, and that is what the retailers told us. The market will make decisions.
But they made clear, didn't they, that the market doesn't look like it's got any interest in that?
Well, they made clear that the market is transitioning, and we're seeing a greater focus on renewables, and we know that. But once we have the level of investment certainty that we all want for our energy system going forward, then the market will be best placed to work out the role of a high-efficiency, low-emission coal-fired plant or another form of gas generator, or indeed a form of renewables with storage. You see, our approach is technology neutral rather than Labor's ideological approach. And if we can get baseload affordable power from a Healy plant or a gas-fired power station or renewables with storage, then we'll take it. And that's why I've written to the head of the Australian Energy Market Operator to actually tell us what does the system need going forward, particularly with large generators like Liddell in New South Wales scheduled to close in 2022.
Minister, surely there's a contradiction in what you've just said in response to Peter. You're saying on the one hand that the government wants new coal plants. That is a policy. Yet you're also saying you'll let the market decide. How do you square that circle?
Well, the government stands ready to ensure the best possible outcomes in the marketplace if the market itself can't deliver that. Now, we have written to the Australian Energy Market Operator to actually tell us what is needed in terms of dispatchable power, Paul. So that has been our clear position for some time. Let's wait and see what the advice of the market operator is as to what type of generation we need in the system. A Healy plant does need to be considered, just as thermal gas generation does, just as renewables with storage does.
So can I ask though, so am I right in my understanding about this? The traditional party of the market, the Liberal Party, will go against the market if the market doesn't see an interest in coal-fired power because it doesn't have the investment certainty and all the rest to go for it. Is that what the modern Liberal Party's become?
Well, Peter, if you look at the energy market today, it's quite clear that it's not working as first intended. The fact is we're seeing very high prices, but outside of renewable investment, which has been supported by the renewable energy target, we haven't seen thermal generation. So the last gas-fired power station built in Australia was at Mortlake in Victoria in 2010. The last coal-fired power station built in Australia was Cogan Creek in Queensland in 2007. And if we're going to get more thermal generation into the mix, then we have to look at all options available to the government.
Now, Minister, you've stressed and the Prime Minister's stressed the absolute centrality of the pricing factor here, that
Yes.
this is what the government is looking at. What are your hopes in terms of containing prices over the course of the next period before the election? And I guess tied into that is, what do you see as the really critical factors driving prices at the moment?
Well, the first thing to say is there is no silver bullet to getting lower prices. You need to take action on all fronts, on the generation side, on the retailer side, on the network side, and indeed in terms of the storage side for renewables. We recently received a report from the Australian Energy Market Commission which pointed the finger at three main causes for the higher prices. One was the higher gas prices, and gas has tripled in the last 5 years, and gas is now playing an increasingly important role in setting the price of electricity. And the AEMC pointed the finger at the fact that we're now exporting more gas than ever before, and that we also have these state-based moratoriums that are preventing the development of gas resources. The other reasons why prices have been rising is because investors are waiting to see what is the level of regulatory certainty they can get to make these long-term investments. And then the third reason was because we've seen the closure of major coal-fired power stations, namely Hazelwood and the Northern Power Station in particular, and the impact that that has had in creating a tight supply-demand balance. So we need to do and to act on all fronts. That's what we're seeking to do. But I have to point out here, Paul and Peter, that the Labor Party has a lot to answer for, particularly when it comes to the gas situation we find ourselves in. Despite Mark Butler, the shadow portfolio for energy, saying explicitly on Insiders just a couple of months ago that they weren't warned about the impact the large exports would have on price, we've now discovered a 2012 report by the Australian Energy Market Operator, which did warn about the impact on supply. And we know that from Labor's own 2012 Energy White Paper, they talked about the higher prices and the tighter supply that would flow from having more gas exports. So Labor has a lot to answer for.
Well, Minister, on prices, what is the government offering on prices over the next 18 months?
Well, the gas restrictions, Paul, should help provide more supply. And the fact that the Prime Minister talked tough with the LNG companies is already starting to have a flow-through effect. So we've seen the spot price for gas come down from the highs at the start of the year, and that will flow through in the form of lower prices. When it comes up to network charges, which make up around 50% of the household bill, the returns for those companies was averaging around 10% when Labor was in office. We've now got that down over 2016 to just above 6%. So that will have a significant and positive impact, together with our decision to abolish the limited merits review. And then the actions of just last week, where the Prime Minister called in the energy retailers and spoke very strongly to them about the need for them to empower consumers to make the choice as to the best offer available to them in the market. We got some significant commitments out of those retailers. We saw, for example, over 50,000 Australians go onto the website in the last couple of days just to start comparing the offers that are available. If we can get clearer information, better information and more comparable information, then I think customers can, as the AER has said, the Australian Energy Regulator, benefit by more than $1,000 simply by moving retailers or contracts.
Energy and Environment Minister Josh Frydenberg, we appreciate your time on this Sunday morning. Thanks very much for your company.
Good to be with you.
You're watching